Oh, no, 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 no. Mary, Queen of Scots is not exactly unfamiliar material to those who've been watching film for a while. For example, I myself am more familiar with the 1971 version that of course had Timothy Dalton. And being a massive Bond fan, that of course attracted me to that film, which of course led me to the story of the original concept behind the book being adapted for these films. And I can say with full honesty, there's a lot of good that comes out of this year's, well, I suppose last year's rendition of Mary, Queen of Scots, but it was clearly hoping for a little more Oscar consideration than it actually got. For instance, Saoirse Ronan is, I think how you pronounce her name, she should have been, at least in my opinion, in the running for the Academy Award for Best Actress, because she really does nail it. She becomes Mary, she becomes a completely out of her own comfort zone character, and it works, and she is a much more appealing rendition of the character than I think we got in previous adaptations of the book, so well done. But an even bigger plus has to go to Margot Robbie as Queen Elizabeth. Whoa! I realized there was some prosthetics involved with disguising her face a bit, but unrecognizable. If you did not know that was Margot Robbie, you wouldn't know it was Margot Robbie. She nails it. Even though the character of Elizabeth is a little less about trying to maintain control and a little more about cross-stitching and flower patterns, and I don't know where that came from. And the music, oh my goodness, how many more films are going to beg me to buy their soundtrack? This is gorgeous. It's admittedly got reused themes throughout. There's one that plays when Mary first arrives in Scotland that also plays when she meets the inevitable conclusion of this very well-known story. I don't think it's a spoiler to say Mary, Queen of Scots is executed at the end. It's a very well-known ending. But if that was a spoiler, I'm very sorry. But we're talking about book based on history that is incomplete and a few gaps are filled in. Mary isn't the sort of film I would normally go to see in the cinema because it's what I call Oscar bait. It's a film that ponces up with a big cast and a big budget and a really scenic set and says, I'm going for the Oscar. So I'm going to come out at the very end of the year and just squeeze in before the Oscar cutoffs. So I'm fresh in everybody's mind and everybody gives me all the Academy Awards. It's something that I can't stand. It infuriates me because then you get films that came out, say, in the earlier portion of the year, like the first quarter of the year, and they're almost forgotten because the poncy, oh, we're going for the Oscar films are straight into the Academy's mind because they're the newest film. But it's not going to help this film at all because with the exception of makeup and costume, which it was nominated for, it's got virtually nothing else. Not even music. I was surprised. I thought for sure this would be up for Best Original Score, but nope. This is a beautifully shot film. The landscapes, the cinematography, it's all gorgeous. And the costumes, the camera work. This is a film made by someone who knows how to make something look pretty. The contrast so that the infamous red dress at the end just properly pops out of the screen up against all the other colors. Beautifully done. But this red dress leads me to some of the bad things, to be fair, about the film. These are brilliantly cast characters, but they are the wrong characters. For starters, Mary shouldn't have had a Scottish accent. If anything, based on what we know, she should have spoke English with a French twang. Elizabeth was not quite so passive in the original story. She didn't want to know any of the details that came in, and she refused anyone to tell her updates on the civil war breaking out in Scotland. But she wasn't quite so Gromit from Wallace and Gromit while everything was going down. This film had an idea for how to tell this story, and it comes down to men taking advantage of vulnerable women in leadership roles, which is not entirely how things played out, as I recall in the original story. Yes, the men do have this, where women can't be queens. Of course they do. It was a product of the time. But for the Protestants versus Catholics thing, that was more played on than the actual hatred of the Queen herself. It was more the Catholic Queen than the Queen. It's hard to really decipher where it all went wrong for her. It can be traced back to making one mistake, and that's when the Queen sends an emissary to wed Mary, Queen of Scots, and says that you do this and we will put you in line to succeed me in the throne, because Mary always had a stronger claim to the throne, or so it's believed. And this is just the basic story that we know from the history books. But then all the gaps being filled in, Darnley being sent instead to tempt her, is what the Queen was supposed to do. But he almost gets sent there by mistake in the new version, or at least, if there was a reason for him to be there, it got left on the cutting room floor. Of course, Mary falls in love with Darnley, and they have a kid, and that's when everything starts to go wrong, because then the leadership is questioned, there's rumors about her killing her husband so that she could remarry, and this is all part of why Mary ultimately falls. But in this film, she's painted as a tragic character who just simply got constantly betrayed and constantly turned on. And that is true to an extent, but in this film, you see such absolute loyalty from the people around her until it suits the plot for them to betray her. Whereas in the original story, the eventual decline in their respect is shown and showcased for everyone to see. And it irritates me because a film that shows this better is the one from 1971, which is exactly the same runtime as this one. But miraculously enough, this version of the film had more time for cross-dressing gags than it did for the inevitable betrayal of her people around her. And this is one of the things, the betrayals. They're not built up. One of her most loyal subjects just turns on her in an instant. And again, in the older versions, in the older adaptations, it is more shown how this came to be. In fact, this is going into spoilers, but again, it's a well-known story. She fell in love with her sort of bodyguard, the one sworn to protect her, and they plotted to kill her husband, which is why when she went to Elizabeth and said, "Give me an army so that I can take back Scotland," Elizabeth said, "That's fine, you can have your army, but for the sake of appearances and my reputation, you will need to stand trial, and you'll be found innocent of murdering your husband, and then you'll be off to take back Scotland." But because Mary so stubbornly says, "No, I'm not going to stand trial," the reason is because she knows that she was involved in it and she'll be found guilty. And in my opinion, that's why she refuses to do the trial and why she ultimately ends up imprisoned and finally plotting the Queen's death from inside her cell and forcing her to execute her. In this film, she has no knowledge of the death of her husband. She plays no part in it. So what they did at the end was, instead of, "Oh, well, we'll give you a trial and then give you the army," she basically just says, "No, I'm not going to give you an army," which is completely different to how it played out. Because the whole point of her incarceration is that she was involved and refused to be on trial for it. At least that's what I've got from the story, from when I've read into it. And ultimately, this leads to Mary's incarceration, and she plots the Queen's downfall with her people from the outside, and the Queen is forced, against her will, to basically say, "Look, okay, I'll forgive you, and I won't execute you, just write down on something, just write down on this bit of parchment that you beg my forgiveness." And her refusal to do that, because she thinks she was somehow better or lost, depending on how you perceive the whole story, she refuses to do that, and she goes for the chop in that infamous scene where she's not wearing black, she's wearing red to showcase her rebellion and defiance. And it's an impactful scene in every adaptation of the film, including the one that I'm reviewing today. But the film doesn't earn it. The film literally has them speaking to each other, and then all of a sudden she's for the chop. And to someone who doesn't know the story, they could have thought that the people in Scotland basically framed her for attempts on Elizabeth's life and forced Elizabeth to execute her for that. But in the case of the real story, Mary was actually plotting against Elizabeth from inside her cell, as far as we can tell. And she never wanted to have anything to the contrary to say in front of anybody. So that's what we have to go by. But like I said, in this film, you won't know that because it just goes from them speaking to each other to, "I have to sentence you to death because I've heard you're plotting against me." Well, we don't see any of that. It's not alluded to. It's just, boop, you're for the chop now. It just takes too many liberties. It takes too many liberties with main known story devices to try and tell its own story, which ultimately comes across to me as the director trying to tell men taking control of women in a hierarchy position the movie. And essentially that's what it comes across as. The men making the decisions, the women taking the back seat because the men just rise up against them. And I don't think personally that that's the story as a whole. There is aspects of that, of course there are. But that's not the whole story, which is what this film would have you believe. That Mary was a tragic character that never rebelled, never gave anybody any reason to hate her or execute her, and that just simply isn't true. But again, the film is beautifully shot, beautifully acted, and the score is wonderful, so I'm gonna have to say that it is worth seeing. It's a good movie. In fact, it's a very good movie, but I'll tell you right now, if you like your films depressing, you'll think this is the best thing ever. Because the film just goes darker, 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 just completely deprived of any aspect of happiness for the final, I would say, hour and a half. It just gets worse and worse and worse. Not in a bad film sense, but in a, oh, this is hard to watch sense. And that is why I probably never need to see this film again. But I do think it is worth seeing. But just be mindful that this isn't really telling the real story as we know it to be. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. It's a pleasure to be back in front of the camera again. I've been busy with gaming related stuff because there's all sorts of things that I want to talk about in upcoming videos. The arrival of Count Dooku in Battlefront. I've been playing a lot of Battlefront, trying to fund not only Dooku, but also Anakin. So if you want to add my gamer tag, Fatal Shock space V7, and join me on Xbox and help me fund Anakin and Dooku, you're more than welcome to. I've also been playing the Anthem beta, which I'm going to have a review for shortly because there's a lot to talk about there. But yes, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, tear that like button limb from limb. And if you want to be among the first to be notified of new content on the channel, go ahead and slam that subscribe button and ring the bell. And I will see you guys next time.